My name is Ash Reeves, and I want to tell you something about 0%. 0% is not a fact. It is a pattern, and patterns have reasons. Find the reasons. Find the reason and the pattern changes. That is not optimism. That is engineering. I have been an engineer long enough to know that nothing fails without a reason, and nothing is impossible once you understand what is actually preventing it. 3 teams had gone into the Odyssey installation and not come back. The briefing room knew this. Everyone sitting in the chairs around the table knew this. The Cathiran mission commander, a senior officer named Vale Thorn, who had the expression of someone delivering information they wished they did not have, knew this better than anyone. He laid it out cleanly. The Ardennes installation was an abandoned deep space research facility that had been dark for 6 years, located in the outer Dravosi belt at a position that made it strategically important to the current patrol authority operation in the zone. 3 reconnaissance teams had been sent in to assess it for reactivation. None had returned. Signal contact had been lost with each team at the same point in the approach, approximately 400 meters from the installation's outer airlock. The 4th team needed a volunteer with structural and systems knowledge, because the working theory was that the installation itself was the problem, not external threat. I raised my hand. Not because I wanted to be a hero. I raised my hand because I had been sitting in that briefing room for 40 minutes, listening to the information about the 3 previous teams, and I had noticed something that apparently nobody else had noticed, or if they had noticed it, they had not said it out loud. And I wanted to go in because I thought I knew what was happening, and I wanted to test whether I was right. Vale Thorn looked at me with the expression of someone who had expected volunteers to be harder to come by. I told him what I had noticed and what I thought it meant, and what I thought it meant, and what I planned to do about it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said I was on the team. The thing I had noticed was in the signal data from the 3 previous teams. Each team had lost contact at the same point, 400 meters out, which was the working assumption everyone had been operating from, but the signal data showed something more specific than that. The contact loss was not a sudden cutoff. It was a degradation pattern starting approximately 800 meters out and becoming complete at 400. And the degradation pattern had a specific frequency signature that I recognized from 7 years of working with deep space installation systems. It was the signature of a power cycling event in a large capacitive system. The Ardennes installation had been dark for 6 years, but dark did not mean dead. Emergency power systems on installations of that class ran on closed-loop generators that could maintain low-level function for decades without external input, and certain safety systems on installations of that class, specifically the perimeter electromagnetic containment systems designed to protect sensitive research equipment from external interference, drew from those emergency generators automatically when the installation's primary power was interrupted. An electromagnetic containment perimeter, strong enough to protect sensitive research equipment, was also strong enough to degrade communication signals at 800 meters and eliminate them completely at 400. And a perimeter system that had been running on emergency power for 6 years with no maintenance and no load regulation would be cycling in ways its designers had not intended, building charge in its capacitive arrays between cycles and releasing it in pulses that would do considerably more than degrade a signal if a person in a standard suit happened to be in the 400-meter zone when one of those pulses fired. I told the team this on the transit to the installation. There were 5 of us, 2 Cathiran soldiers named Oren and Saul, the Harath, the communications officer named Rev, a Tethian data analyst named Kale, and me. They listened to my assessment with the careful attention of people who had been briefed on 0% and were very interested in any theory that changed that number. When I finished, Oren asked the question that mattered. How do we get past the perimeter without a pulse hitting us? I told him. The capacitive cycle had a timing pattern. I had calculated it from the signal degradation data in the 3 previous teams' telemetry, working backward from the degradation curve to estimate the cycle frequency and the pulse interval. The cycle was not random. It was a mechanical processes, and mechanical processes have consistent timing within a range, and the range I had calculated gave us a window of approximately 90 seconds between pulses during which the perimeter field was at its lowest charge state. 90 seconds to cover 400 meters in a suit was achievable if we moved immediately and did not stop. There was one complication. The timing calculation was based on 3 data points, one from each previous team, which was enough to establish a pattern, but not enough to be certain of the exact interval. I had a range of confidence, not a precise number, which meant the 90-second window was an estimate, and the actual window was an estimate, and the actual window could be shorter. I told them this clearly because they needed to know what they were working with. Drev asked what shorter meant in practical terms. I told him it meant we moved fast and we did not hesitate at the line. He nodded once and said nothing else, which was the right response. We positioned ourselves at 800 meters and I watched my instruments and counted the cycle indicators I could detect at this range and calculated and recalculated and recalculated, and when the numbers told me we were in the window, I said, "Go." And we went. 400 meters in standard suits, moving at the pace that people move when 0% is behind them and a closing window is in front of them. I counted seconds while I ran. We crossed the 400-meter threshold at 73 seconds. The pulse fired at 91. We felt it as a vibration through our suits, strong enough to be uncomfortable and strong enough to tell me that my calculation had been closer to the short end of the range than the long end. But we were inside the perimeter and the field strength inside was lower than outside and we were intact. Orrin looked at me through his helmet display. I gave him a nod that meant what I thought it meant. He gave me one back that meant the same thing. The installation interior was dark and cold, and had the specific quality of a place that had been sealed against the outside for a very long time. Emergency lighting gave us enough to move by, and my instruments gave us the rest. I worked the internal systems from the first junction we reached, because 6 years of emergency power operation left traces in the system logs that told me the installation's story in technical language I could read as clearly as text. The primary power system had failed in a cascade event 6 years ago, triggering the emergency shutdown that had darkened the installation and activated the perimeter system. The cascade had started in the main reactor coupling, which I found in the lower-level engineering section after 40 minutes of moving through dark corridors with the rest of the team behind me. The coupling was damaged but not destroyed. A specific component had failed and in failing had initiated the cascade, and that component was the kind that installations of this class carried 3 spares of in the engineering section supply locker, because it was the kind of component that failed under sustained high-load operation, and the designers had known that. I found the supply locker. I found 2 of the 3 spares. The third had been used at some point, which told me someone had been here after the cascade, had found the same component I had found, had replaced it once already, and that replacement had also failed, which meant the root cause was not the component itself, but the load condition driving the component to failure. I spent 20 minutes tracing the load condition and found it in the power distribution array, a misaligned regulator that had been generating excess load on the coupling since the installation's initial startup, slowly and reliably working toward the failure that had eventually come. I corrected the regulator alignment. Then I replaced the coupling with the second spare. Then I ran the startup sequence, and the installation's primary power came online for the first time in 6 years, and the lights came on, and the perimeter system received the primary power signal it had been waiting for and completed its controlled shutdown, and the 400-meter field dropped to nothing. The team stood in the suddenly lit engineering section and looked at each other. Kale, the Tethian data analyst who had said very little since we crossed the perimeter, looked at me with large dark eyes that held something quiet and genuine. "You knew it would work," she said. "I knew what the problem was," I said. "Working was the expected result of fixing it. Before we crossed the perimeter," she said. "When you told us about the pulse window, you were not certain of the timing." "No," I said. "I had a range." "But you went anyway," she said. "The range was good enough to work with," I said. Waiting for certainty was not an option that led anywhere useful. She was quiet for a moment. 3 teams, she said. 3 teams who did not know what the perimeter was doing, I said. "Once you know what it is, you can work with it." Orrin contacted Vale Thorn from the installation's restored communications array and reported our status, and I listened to the silence on the other end of the comm that lasted 2 seconds longer than silence usually lasts when you are a mission commander who is briefed. 3 previous teams on 0%. Then, Velthorn said, "Copy that," and his voice had something in it that briefing room voices rarely have. He said, "Well done." He said it simply and directly, and I believed he meant every word of it. We spent 6 hours running full installation diagnostics and documenting the repair work and preparing the reactivation report, and by the time the relief team arrived, the Arden installation was fully operational for the first time in 6 years, and the perimeter system was in controlled standby mode, and nobody else was going to lose contact at 400 meters. On the transit back, Vale Thorn hailed us directly. He said the mission report would reflect the technical analysis that had made the difference and asked me to prepare a full documentation of the diagnostic and repair sequence for the Patrol Authority Technical Archive. I said I would. He said one more thing before he closed the channel. He said the patrol authority had been operating on the assumption that the Arden installation was unrecoverable and had been planning to write it off the active asset register. My documentation would change that, and the installation's strategic value to operations in the outer Dravosi zone was significant. He paused. Hen, he said, that 0%, in his experience, was always a description of what had been tried before, not a description of what was possible. I thought about that on the rest of the transit home. He was right. 0% was a pattern, and patterns had reasons, and reasons could be found. That was the whole thing. That had always been the whole thing.